Hi and welcome to RC Modders, and this is the 7th video in the Bruder telehandler radio control conversion series. This is in fact the 4th build video, where in the previous 3 we first of all looked at dismantling the original Bruder toy and then adapting the original wheels so that they could be fitted to N20 gearbox motors, and then in the last video, using bespoke 3D printed parts, adapted the chassis in order that we could have 4-wheel drive and 4-wheel steering. In this 4th video we're going to be focusing on the body shell and adapting that to fit on the chassis ahead of the video which will follow this, where we're going to fully radio control the telescopic arm and automate the bucket. Before I go any further, I think I ought to just quickly outline what I'm going to be covering in this video. So first of all, the main tools that we're going to be using. Secondly, I'll run through the components. We'll be trimming and fitting the wheel arches, tidying the motor wires from last time, trimming the main body and side cover, and I think that is probably the most substantial part of this video, fitting the telescopic arm servo, installing the second speed controller, fitting the on-off switch, tidying all of those wires, and generally getting ourselves ready ahead of the next video on the telescopic arm. As I've said in all of the previous videos, the builds are deliberately quite detailed in order that people of all levels of experience can realistically have a go at completing this project successfully. I'm sure that the more experienced modelers and modders are likely to skip through, and I'll try and figure out a way in the description to provide links to each part of this video. Okay, tools. In terms of tools, I think it's fairly similar to those which we've used in the previous build videos, but I'll just run through quickly the ones which I think we're going to be needing. So the drill, 2.5 3mm drill bits, countersink, 1.5mm drill bit. A pin vise is quite useful for that. I find that I often need the M3 0.5mm tap, 2mm and 2.5mm hex drives, small screwdrivers, hacksaw blade ideally in a handle, side cutters and a marker pen. In this stage there is a little bit of soldering to be done, so you're going to need a soldering iron, some solder and some 2mm heat shrink. Component wise, obviously the main part is going to be the body as well as this cover inside. A couple of recently designed 3D printed parts. This one is a template to help you drill holes in the right places for mounting the 20kg servo, and this one will hold the aerial wires for the receiver. You will need a second speed control just the same as the first one, so this is the 10 variety, and a 20kg servo. This one is supposedly got 180 degrees turn on it. You're going to need some double-sided foam mounting tape plus a few bits of hardware. So what we've got here, I've got 4 M3 washers, a couple of, I think that they're 18mm countersunk machine bolts, a couple of 20mm normal machine bolts, some fairly short, I think that they're probably about 8mm M2 bolts. These ones are countersunk, although I don't think that is strictly necessary, and some M3 lock nuts. As I've said in the previous videos, I'm putting links in the description for all of the parts and some of the tools which I'm using in order that people can easily identify them and get hold of them themselves. Oh, I almost forgot the wheel arches, which are actually going to be the next stage of the build. Okay, so I think that that's about it for components. Let's do the wheel arches. When I was first designing the model, I was really determined that I would try and retain these, and I think I managed to do it in quite a good way. So I'll just take the wheel off for a moment. Now, if you look very carefully, you can see that there is actually a hole that goes all the way through here, a square hole, and these little tabs here are sticking out. Those are actually designed to locate onto the wheel arch pieces once some trimming's been done. So I'll just take the first one, which is this one here, and each of the wheel arches goes with one of the corners, and I think that actually the sort of opposite corners are probably the same as each other. Just taking the first one here, we're going to carefully trim most of the plastic off. So I'm starting with this back arm here, and that's going to be about there. Then inside, across there, and then I'm going to cut there, and I'm going to cut there. You want to do this quite slowly and carefully. Basically what you want to end up with is the two pieces which are coming down. You haven't trimmed anything off the bottom of them at all. You want these to be as long as possible. The next thing to do is to trim the bottom off so that you're keeping the same shape all the way down. So I'll just do a little bit more with these just to make it easy as possible. There's a little bit in there, so I'll just chop that across, and then I'm going to trim the remainder off using the craft knife. I'm trying to do this so that the camera can actually see what I'm doing. So I'm going to chop down there. Basically make sure the whole thing is squared off. I think that this one here is probably okay now. I'll just do the other leg. Certainly worth putting a new blade in the Stanley knife. And then just keep going until you've got the same shape all the way down. And that is about it, I think. Let's just give it a quick test. So this thinner one goes in the hole. And if it's feeling a little bit tight, you just go back and trim a little bit more off. It doesn't hurt if the very tip is slightly smaller than further up. So I'm just going to almost whittle a little bit off there. But you really don't want to lose any length. So this should be a nice tight fit in the hole. Let's just check. That's it. Perfect. And then you can see how far down it needs to go by just loosely popping the wheel back on again, and then perhaps just bringing it back up slightly to about there. And what you'll notice is that the way this moulding goes, it actually makes room for the tire in there. And then having got it into the right place, you can give it a quick test just to make sure that everything's running smoothly and that nothing is fouling. That seems to be good. I'll just go around and do the other three. Okay, so that's all four of them done. And I think that the wheel arches actually enhances the finished model quite a bit. Okay, so for this next part we're going to focus on tidying these wires away underneath the plate so that they don't get tangled up when it's being used. The first thing that we need to think about is that as soon as you take this plate off here, the model will try and fall apart by itself, and that is really aggravating, and you actually risk damaging the connections to the motors. So the first thing that we need to think about is a way of securing these so that they don't fall out all the time. Now, just before you go any further, I can't remember if I mentioned gluing in the little inserts that were in this bottom plate here. I'll just show you quickly what I'm talking about. So if you remember in the last episode when we were trimming the chassis, we actually put these inserts here in after we had located where that bar should go. These can work loose while you're using the model, and that would sort of mess the steering up. So as an extra precaution, it's just worth using some super glue to glue those in place. So in order to stop it falling apart, when I was doing the prototype, I actually drilled holes in these parts here, but I since went back into Tinkercad, changed the part and put 1.5mm holes in them. Probably worth at this point, if you had got a body reamer, just to go through and slightly enlarge the end of the holes, and then taking the M3 washer and the M2 screws, quickly popping those into the ends. As long as the screws aren't more than about 8mm long, you should be okay, and they certainly won't hit the motors. They don't need to be desperately tight, but just enough that the washers aren't moving around. Okay, so that's all of those done. Next thing to do is we can remove this bar. This is something that hopefully we won't be needing again. Next thing is just move one or two of the wires out of the way. I'm just going to unplug some things as well. We need to get this plate out here. Generally it should just lift, like so. Just move that. And without breaking any wires, so being extra careful. Good, we should be able to get it out. Great. Okay, so now we can see what's what. I have actually left the wires in place because we're going to want to be able to test this as we go along to make sure that everything's working properly. Now the idea is we're going to be threading these wires through the holes that we made in the chassis earlier, and because we had already worked out which way everything went, we should be able to get the wires in the right place. So throughout this whole process we're actually going to want to be able to test the model as we go along. The first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to identify which wires go to the left of the terminal block and which go to the right. So I grabbed the bundle of 4 wires which go to the left. I'm going to take my screwdriver and undo those. Just going to twist them together for a moment, and then I'm going to put a cable tie around, not tight but just enough to keep them together. This is mainly because I don't want to have to do the trial and error thing all over again to establish which wire goes on which side. And I don't actually need to do this for the wires on the other side, because if it isn't in this bundle here, it doesn't go on the left hand side of the terminal block. Undo that side, and we should have 4 wires, so 2 from this end and 2 from the other end. Now the next part of the job is something where you need to be patient, but it's not terribly difficult. What we need to do is we need to thread the wires through the chassis, leaving some slack at the end so that the wheel can turn easily, and have the wires going all the way through underneath where this plate is going to slide and ending at the correct side next to the terminal block. Probably quite a good idea to use some small long nose pliers. I'm just going to thread all of the wires and then I'll be back. I actually decided that it was better to start with this hole here, and so we end up with the 2 wires coming through. You'll see that in this case the black wire is probably much longer than we need it to be. Leave it like that for now. Before moving on to the next wire, we should actually test it very quickly. So I'll just put those into the terminal block. In fact, during this stage it might be easier just to remove the terminal block so that we can get to it more easily. When I push the stick forward, the wheel is moving in the forward direction, so we know that one is fine. Next job is to go around and do this for the other 3. It's time consuming, it's fiddly, but it's not difficult. Okay, so these wires are all done. I actually just disconnected the chair from this side so that we can see what we're doing. So we have a bundle of wires coming through the hole on this side, and then we have another bundle of 4 wires coming through the other side. All of the wires are different lengths depending on which motor that they're coming from. We do need to be sure that in the very inside position, so the steering like that, that none of the wires are too stretched, because that's the most distance that we're going to get. The fact that they're all different lengths isn't terribly helpful. So I'm going to take all of the wires going through the hole which is towards the front, and without going too far, I'm going to chop them all so that they're the same length as each other. Okay, so that's these 4. With the wires on the other side, I'm going to need to do a similar thing, but actually I'm only going to chop this black wire here which I've got, which is much longer than the rest. Going back to the 4 wires here towards the front, I'm going to strip each of them probably by about 6mm. I'll just do that. And then I'm going to take those 4 wires and I'm going to twist them all together. Okay, so they're all together. Then I'm going to very carefully put them into the terminal block, having twisted the wires on both the left and the right. Plug it all in. Okay, a quick test. And that all seems to be okay. And then carefully unscrew one side. Twist all the wires back together again, making sure that they're nicely joined to each other. That is, of course, if they've decided to start separating like they have here. And then solder the wires together. And then do the other side. Well, if you completed this bit successfully, you've done what I think is by far the hardest part of the build. It's probably the only bit of the build which I didn't particularly enjoy. But having done that, it should be plain sailing all the way from here. Okay, so the next thing to do is to reinstall the steering plate. The terminal block has already been put back in, and so that's fine, and the wires kind of just tucked away in there. You may notice that the wires here are actually a little bit higher. That isn't a problem because when the steering goes all the way over, it doesn't actually quite reach the edge, so that should be fine. And that is that part of the build done. Next job to do is to trim the inside of the main body so that it's going to fit on there. This is actually where it becomes useful, the fact that I've already done this before, because it took me quite a long time to work out bit by bit what I needed to remove on the original prototype. With this one we ought to be able to go straight to it. So it looks as if we've got to remove material in a number of different places, and I think that the place that I'm going to start is in this area here and here. And what I'm going to do for each part is I'm actually going to mark it out with a pen so you can see where I'm going to cut it first, and then we'll make the cuts. So the first bit that we're going to do is we're going to cut out this area sort of roughly around there, and I hope that that's coming out in the video. Yep, so that area there, and that should give us room for the steering arm to move up and down. And the other place I want to chop across is kind of along there, but in a slightly straight line. So let's do that and see if this stuff in this area here fits. That all looks pretty good to me. So next we need to cut out a whole load in this back area here. I'll try and mark out where it is, and hopefully you can see on the camera. So where there's a hole here, we need to come across all the way down. I think it might be useful to leave a small tab going across because it might help us secure some wires afterwards, and then up the other side in about the same place. So that whole area there needs to go. We need to cut out everything in the base here. So I'm just going to, I'll just move the camera very slightly. So we're going to be going all the way along there, all the way along there. So that might require some filing perhaps rather than sawing, we'll see in a minute. To there, and then we need to chop out almost to the very back, certainly to about the edge of there, and I would say it's kind of like that. I would actually say across the back there, and this whole area here. So it's actually most of this back area needs to be removed. Once I get the hacksaw in there, I can actually remove material quite quickly, so I'll just go ahead and do that. Right, okay, so I think that is most of what I wanted to remove. The only extra thing that I really wanted to do was to take this extra layer of plastic off here and get it down so that it's flush with the side there. And for doing that, I think that I'm probably going to use either the Dremel or the file. Looks like I'm going to be filing it. Okay, so if you put yourself into a reasonably patient frame of mind, this would actually file down to about the same level. On the prototype that wasn't so much of an issue, but I ended up with a great big hole here where the servo is, and this time I'm trying to have the servo hidden behind. That was probably only about 10 minutes filing, and gone out patiently. It really isn't too much of a problem, and it's not very hard to get fat. You can sort of tell when you've got there. So the next bit that we want to remove is just here. I'll just mark that with the mark pen. So we're going to take out this whole piece here, which is the bit which holds the fake exhaust on. I might be able to figure out by the end a way of reattaching that, so let's see if I do. I'll try and remember that. Side cutters can make things a lot easier. If you get them in there, that's it. And then just generally, if you want to tidy some of this up a little bit, just use the file, and maybe if you've got some scraggly bits, use the nice trim it, just get that cleaned up. So that's this area here, which I think should be okay. We've got the area inside there for the steering, the area here where the wires are. One thing that we do need is we're going to need another hole here for the wires to come through, kind of about there, and it's going to need to be big enough to thread servo plugs through. One there, let's say. It's actually quite a difficult angle. Maybe I can get the body reamer in there. That seems to be okay. Just enlarge those two holes. That's right. Then the side cutters. Okay, so there's no sharp edges there. I think that should serve our purposes pretty well. Happy with that, and I think that that is the main body done. While we're covered in dust, let's just have a quick look at this. Okay, so it looks as if I left most of it intact. There was a piece here which I trimmed off. That must have been to do with the telescopic arm, so I'll do the same thing here. I think it went sort of down there like that, across, and I trimmed out the inside here, and that would have been so that I can get the receiver in there nicely, something like that. I think that's okay. And then the other thing which I did was I kind of removed most of this round area. Yep, happy with that. Let's just see how that sits on the body. If we wanted to, we could actually test this. I'll just pop this piece back in, mainly to test that it's still fitting in there right, and that's absolutely fine. I'll just clear up, put the kettle on, and then I'll be back.